Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Today we're going to expand the city up into the hillside, making use of a few different techniques and an eclectic variety of assets to create a dense neighborhood that has a mix of new and old development. Before we put down any buildings though, we need to get some more roads put down. I thought this large arcing avenue from Duluth would be a sensible place to form the border of our downtown, much like it does in Duluth. This is called Masaba Avenue. I think that's how it's pronounced. And in Duluth, it has a somewhat limited interaction with the street grid and even some things like off-ramps. So I think we're going to take inspiration from this and the shape, but go in a slightly different direction. Originally, I thought that this must have been a more recent addition to the downtown in Duluth, but it seems like there's been a road following this route since at least 1874 when this map was published, where it's labeled Piedmont Avenue here. So I ended up trying to have it both ways. I skipped the limited access parts like the off-ramps and replaced the couplet system that I originally had tried out with just a single avenue. But I'm still going to go ahead and maintain a pretty decent capacity with 3 lanes in each direction. I'm using this avenue from the Big Urban Roads pack, and that's going to give us a lot of flexibility for things like turning lanes and medians passing through smaller intersections so we can reduce the number of traffic lights, stuff like that. Plus the networks just look nice and tasty. Other than that, I wanted to extend a few more of the important avenues uphill as well, all across the downtown, and then connect everything together with now we just need to delumpify the intersections with node controller, and we can get to building. The plan for today is to fill in this stretch of downtown between what we built a few episodes ago and the new avenue. We're going to start with a lower density mixed use zone with a combination of old structures and new infill, then add in a couple more modern apartment towers as a buffer between the downtown and the hospital district, an important historic building, and a denser mixed-use zone so that we can taper down from the skyline to the lower density zone. Let's go ahead and start with this eclectic neighborhood. Like I said before, I want the development along the avenue to represent the border between downtown and the rest of the city. So as a result, this land ends up being valuable enough to spur a variety of development like you see in Duluth, but not so valuable that you get the same level of density as the downtown. So I wanted to take a similar approach to the area in Duluth, but putting our own spin on it. So originally this area would have been mostly pre-war, low-density housing like you get in a lot of Midwestern cities around the downtown core. And then later, car-centered commercial developments and the expansion of this big avenue that we just built would have replaced a lot of this. And then even more recently, maybe in the past 30 years or so, new residential buildings, mostly apartments, would have popped up as infill on the sites of older houses, parking lots, and businesses. Another detail I wanted to take from Duluth in this build is these larger brick apartments and brownstones that you'll find scattered among the single-family homes. I don't know if these are new or old, but I like how they look, so I'm going to steal them. I'm going to start off detailing this area with some quick touches to the avenue. Due to the steepening hill here, I figured it would be best to keep these two streets grade separated. I used to have kind of a compulsion to connect every major road to every other major road in every way possible, but recently I've come to realize that sometimes it's more interesting and even realistic to just not do that. So this spot needs a bit of an overpass and a retaining wall as well. Because of that grade separation, there's no access to this neighborhood from this avenue, at least at this point. So I figured that this intersection over here would be a major one. So I'm going to add in a couple of turning lanes. I don't think this set of roads has a way to make dedicated right turn lanes, so I'm going to make my own using IMT to cover up this right-hand lane on this part of the avenue, so that way we have a dedicated right turn lane on the other side of the intersection. And then I'm just going to go ahead and fill it in with IMT and ban cars from driving in that lane. Detailing up the buildings is going to be a little more difficult than the avenue, since I have to have some idea of when they were built and what their surroundings have been like. So these single family homes come pre-detailed, which is really nice. So basically I just have to add some nice big trees in the backyard to sell that they've been here for about a century or so. Then we have the main focus of this neighborhood, which is this church. The asset doesn't really match the kind of architecture that you'd expect here, but I think the green steeple looks like the sort of thing you might see in Duluth. So I think it's going to make a nice little addition on the fringes of the skyline, and it's going to match up with some other assets we're going to add in future episodes. As for its detailing, I'm mostly matching it to the equivalent building in Duluth with a set of stairs out front and a raised platform behind it so that I can have most of this building elevated above the slope, which makes the detailing a lot more straightforward, if not any easier. Although we do get this little bit of clipping around the side, so I'm just going to revert back to the evergreen technique of hiding it behind some shrubbery. Of course, we also have to add a streetcar stop here as well to connect it up with the parts of downtown that are farther down the hill. And I didn't really feel like adding any benches or stuff to the slope here because that can be really annoying, so I'm just going to plop down a couple of signs. I figured that the expansion of the big avenue would have caused a little bit of disruption to the immediate surroundings, so I wanted to show that in a couple of different ways. First, some of the land in between the first row of buildings here and the avenue has been repurposed as a parking lot for the adjacent buildings. And second, over here, we have a mix of newer and older developments that reflect this disruption. So up here, there is a single remaining house on this block that escaped demolition and has added their driveway where the cross street used to go. So they kind of have this whole corner lot to themselves. And to the left here, you can see these more modern townhouses that I plopped down earlier, which would have sprung up sometime after the previous buildings in this spot were demolished because no one wanted to shell out for a detached house that was immediately adjacent to this big retaining wall underneath this giant road. So we have some more dense lower rent housing here. That's just how that kind of thing seems to work. Heading in the opposite direction, moving away from the medical center district and the downtown core, the land is going to get a little bit less valuable. So there hasn't been as much redevelopment and infill here as in the other part of the neighborhood, and a good number of the original single-family homes are still here. We also have this old abandoned shop next to a newer brick townhouse development, which even has its own dedicated parking lot and landscaping, which I think kind of emphasizes the weird contrasts you get with this sort of piecemeal development. Now we're going to go ahead and switch gears and work on a totally different style of development, taking inspiration from, starting with this set of 3 octagonal apartment towers, which I thought was just too intriguing to not copy. I think it's actually a bit harder to detail this sort of isolated building because you have to pay attention to how the entirety of the base of the building interacts with the environment. Whereas when you're doing wall-to-wall development, at least half of the building is always going to be covered up by its neighbors, so there's just a little bit less to pay attention to. Anyway, in this case, I decided to deal with the terrain in a few different ways. First, I'm going to add in the main lobby down here. So this allows us to bridge the gap in the elevation here and cover up the foundation of the nearest tower, which is pretty ugly to have sticking out there. And next to it, you have the usual sort of infrastructure, including a pull-through and a visitor's parking lot for easy car access to the lobby. It's a bit harder to make this landscaped area of grass look reasonable with this extreme slope in the terrain. So I'm going to add a short retaining wall with a grass network behind it so that the slope of the embankment isn't so apparent. I also like when buildings like this have street access that isn't as oriented around cars as the pull-through and the parking lot. So I'm going to add that here in a little break in the retaining wall, and then just add a few details like some steps, a wheelchair accessible ramp, and just a couple other props. Obviously, with a lot of people moving into these towers, it's pretty much going to have a parking garage or a parking lot of some sort, even in our slightly less car-dependent city of Amaranth. So I really just wanted to create the illusion of that back here, kind of matching the curve of the access road to the back of the office here, and then adding in a garage door prop. I suppose I could try to make it functional by adding in some hidden parking spots down there, but I just, at the time, I didn't really think it was necessary. Because most of these roads back here are all at the same level, and then we also have the retaining wall of the access road at the same level, it's pretty easy to deal with the terrain, so I'm just going to add a few grass props to make it appear flat, and then I'm going to place in a token pedestrian path as well, so if people wanted to, they could access the apartments from back here as opposed to the entrance on the side road or next to the office. And a few cluster of trees are going to finish it off. It's a pretty simple build, but I really like what it adds to the skyline. Taking inspiration from this much shorter tower, we're going to build another one across the street. This one gets a surface parking lot for variety's sake, while still having a parking garage over on the side of the building, because why not? And I need to do something to fill all this space. The slope issue for this building is even worse than the other one, so I'm going to take another copy of the building, turn it into a PO so that we can take this brick texture and have it reach just a little bit lower, and then I'm going to surround the whole base of this building with grass props, using PO to angle them at about 45 degrees so that we get this very steep embankment all the way around the building. And other than that, it's just more trees, and that's pretty much it for this one. To finish off this block, I added a couple of courtyard-style apartments, which I'm thinking are intended to visually accompany the base of the hospital. If you'll remember back to that episode, I was talking about how they have used brick and stone at the street level to kind of evoke the historic style of the downtown, even in this modern construction. So they're doing that same thing with these apartments here. And so that way these buildings can fit into their plan of eventually having this whole avenue and maybe even larger parts of the downtown having a consistent look along the street. I didn't spend too much time on detailing these apartments, so we're going to move on to the next part of the build, which is the historic building that I mentioned before. The next build is something I've had my eye on basically since day one of planning this series, which is the old Central High School in Duluth from 1893. The real-life building was actually converted into apartments just last year, I believe. Although I'm not really set on how I want our version to function, so let me know in the comments what you think this building should function as once we build it. The closest asset I could find on the workshop to this is another gem by Darf, which is the old Minnehaha County Courthouse from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Unfortunately for me, some jerk in the 1890s decided to build this building on a corner, so it doesn't really fit into our context properly. So I'm going to make a PO copy of it, mirror it under the Advanced Edition tools, and then carefully clip it back in together so we can have a finished face to the building on all four sides. The hardest part of detailing this were the brick steps out front. What you're seeing now is, I think, my third attempt at building them, and what I ended up going for was getting the proper curvature and slope using this pedestrian path network, and then adding brick wall props to align an IMT and rotating them until they resembled steps. It does look terrible on the outer edge, though, so I'm going to add some low brick walls just to cover that up. It seems like every pedestrian path asset that I have that can actually manipulate the terrain, because not all of them can, have this ruining texture around the outside, which kind of makes me sad. So now I have to go in and add this grass network on top to cover it up. It's not an ideal solution because this asset really isn't intended to be used this way, so it does end up looking a little bit blocky, but I think it's a better solution than just leaving the ruining texture, because under the right lighting conditions, it's a lot harder to notice, whereas the ruining texture is always there. Other than that, the details are pretty sparse, just a couple of old-looking light fixtures and a small landscaping feature around the base of the building using these gravel planters and adding in some nice flowers to brighten things up a bit. Unfortunately, this building has a bit of a dark and violent past, and several years ago, this happened. But since it's here, we might as well detail it up. So I'm going to add this small extension to represent the kind of in-house heating plant that I talked about back in the hospital episode. Or maybe it serves some other purpose, I don't know. But anyway, it has a little area here for delivery of fuel or something like that, plus some parking spots around it for people who are accessing whatever functionality we end up giving to this building. Beyond that, there's really not much to detail here because so much of this block is just neatly trimmed grass. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some trees along the sidewalk, make it a little bit more green, and we're done with that build. And it's time to move on to something a bit more modern. By the way, let me know what you think of this more modern addition to the skyline. I'm still kind of split on it. I think the skyline needs something a little bit more, but I'm not sure about this one in particular. So with the dense part of the downtown expanded out, we need to transition from that into the lower density build we started the episode off with. I actually looked at various parts of Chicago for this, particularly in areas on the fringes of downtown, but before you get into the vast swaths of row houses. I noticed that sometimes you'll get a store with a giant parking lot next to, for example, like a skyscraper or some wall-to-wall development. So I wanted to have some of that, especially since this set of one-way roads that runs through this district is going to carry a lot of traffic into it from the large arcing avenue, which I should probably come up with a name for so I never have to say large avenue again. So anyway, I thought it would make sense that there would be some more demand for car-centered businesses here. So the city gets an Aldi to fulfill that role. Then, to contrast with that, there's a nice little corner shop, and in between that and the Aldi, there's a Dollar General tucked away behind a sad little parking lot. It's kind of an awkward spot to build in, but I think it ends up fitting into the eclectic look that I'm going for in this area. Over here we have another historic building across the street from the old high school, or whatever function it ends up being used as. This one is the old post office, now converted into apartments. Next to that, there are these adorable little townhouses, and a more modern apartment with a pretty sizable parking lot. There's another old building of unknown function over here, next to some wall-to-wall shops, and then a mix of new apartments and older wall-to-wall buildings over here. And with that, we are done with this hillside expansion of the downtown. Obviously, there's a lot more to do, but that is going to come in future episodes. Thanks for watching this episode of Amaranth Bay. Can't wait to see you on the next one.